For decades, the Queen's personal vault was thought to be cleared upon her passing, every document catalogued, every secret sealed. But 2 minutes ago, Princess Anne shattered that illusion. Hidden beneath a decoy drawer, a sealed envelope marked in Elizabeth's own handwriting was uncovered, bearing one name, Camilla. What it contained wasn't just a clause, it was a verdict. And Anne read every word aloud in private council. What she revealed has now sent shockwaves through the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The Windsor Vault had always been regarded as sacred ground, a fortress of royal memory. After Queen Elizabeth's funeral, officials insisted that every paper, every trinket, every confidential note had been catalogued and stored. Nothing was left behind, they said. But not everyone believed that story, especially not Princess Anne. For months, under the veil of grief and solitude, she returned to Windsor, claiming to seek solace. But behind those quiet visits was a deeper mission. She had suspected there was something more, something deliberately left untouched by royal archivists. And she was right. Hidden behind the Queen's antique writing desk, one passed down from Queen Mary herself, Anne discovered a concealed compartment. Inside, a single envelope, yellowed at the edges and sealed with wax, was addressed in Elizabeth's unmistakable handwriting, eyes of the crown only. Beneath it, a second line. Final addendum regarding consort titles and succession influence. Anne hesitated before breaking the seal. The room was silent. Only 3 individuals were present, hand-picked by Anne herself. The atmosphere was tense, as if history itself were holding its breath. As she unfolded the parchment, her hands didn't tremble, but her voice, when she began reading, did. What followed was not just a legal clause, it was a quiet but thunderous dismantling of a carefully constructed narrative. Queen Elizabeth had, in her final private act, drawn a line through Camilla's future role. She had redefined the throne's future with words that would never have passed through Parliament, nor survived the noise of public debate. This wasn't protocol. This was legacy, raw, unfiltered, and utterly intentional. What shocked those present wasn't simply that the document existed. It was how it existed, so precise, so deliberate. The Queen's language was laced with the kind of restraint only learned through decades of rule. There was no anger, no bitterness, just resolve. It was clear that this addendum had been written not in haste, but in contemplation, quietly composed during a time when the nation was watching the monarchy transition. It had remained buried for a reason, and now that it was in the open, the weight of its revelation would tip the scales of power across the royal family. The clause was not merely a suggestion, it was a command from the grave. But it wasn't just the existence of the clause that left the room breathless, it was what the Queen had buried inside it that would unravel loyalties across generations. The Queen had spoken from the grave, and what she said was unforgiving. In language as elegant as it was chilling, she revoked the symbolic elevation of Camilla from queen consort to queen. It wasn't mere preference, it was a command. According to the clause, Camilla's position was to remain supportive, ceremonial, and never sovereign. It was a royal rebuke hidden in plain sight until now. The parchment that Anne unfolded didn't just deliver a message, it wielded judgment. Queen Elizabeth, in her final private decree, drew an unbreakable line between appearance and authority. The words consort in service were underlined with deliberate finality, as if to ensure no one could reinterpret their weight. This wasn't the voice of a grandmother indulging royal sentiment. It was the sovereign protecting her lineage. The clause made it brutally clear: Camilla may walk beside the king, but she would never stand in his place, nor claim a role beyond what tradition allowed. It was as though the Queen had foreseen the brewing campaign to brand Camilla as queen outright, and struck it down before it could take root. But what cut deepest were the Queen's words about legacy. The document revealed her unease with how history would perceive the crown if the public were asked to fully embrace Camilla as its matriarch. There were carefully chosen lines referencing the fragility of public trust and the irreversible impact of perception. And then, one name appeared: Diana. Elizabeth did not speak of her as a shadow of the past, but as a still-living moral force, a force that, according to the Queen, should never be overwritten. In one passage, she confessed that the pain surrounding Diana's fall was a wound never properly mended, and that rewriting that history would only deepen the scar. These weren't just reflections, they were warnings. The clause directly contradicted Charles's public campaign, his speeches, his briefings, the entire machine constructed around the slow evolution of Camilla's image. It exposed the widening gulf between what Charles wanted to solidify and what the Queen had sought to protect. The implication was devastating, that Charles had not only overstepped, but had done so in direct opposition to his mother's dying wish. Yet Elizabeth did not entrust this truth to Charles. She gave it to Anne, and that alone spoke volumes. Anne had been silent for months, declining interviews, deflecting inquiries. Now we know why. She had been the Queen's chosen steward, bound not by public duty, but by personal oath. Her silence was not hesitation. It was preparation. The impact of this clause rippled instantly through the royal inner circle. Legal advisers began reviewing whether Camilla's branding as Queen carried any constitutional weight, or if it was now nullified by the Queen's will. Royal branding experts were silenced. Public image strategies were halted. The ground beneath Camilla's feet had shifted, and with it, so had the monarchy's future. For all her efforts to ascend with dignity, Camilla now found herself portrayed not as a rising queen, but as a figure out of alignment with royal destiny. And the crown, it seemed, had already chosen its course long before the throne had even changed hands. But this wasn't just about titles, it was about power. And what Anne did next would ignite a crisis of command within the palace walls. Anne didn't storm the throne room. She didn't make a speech. She simply walked into the private council chamber and laid the parchment before them. One by one, the expressions of power shifted from confidence to disbelief. In that quiet moment, Anne executed what royal insiders are now calling the most decisive non-violent coup in modern monarchy, and no one, not even Charles, saw it coming. The setting was tightly controlled. Only 5 people knew the meeting was taking place, and only 4 were allowed to attend. Anne, resolute and unflinching, summoned King Charles, Prince William, and 2 senior advisers known only for their absolute discretion. The message was not announced in advance. No agenda was sent. When they entered the chamber, they weren't greeted with protocol, they were greeted with finality. Anne didn't posture. She didn't deliberate. She opened the Queen's sealed parchment, now unburied and undeniable, and read every word aloud, slowly, clearly, without commentary. The words belonged to Elizabeth, and Anne made sure they landed with their full intended weight. Her voice never wavered, but the room did. Charles, once the architect of Camilla's restoration, reportedly froze mid-thought. His complexion drained, and for the first time in recent memory he said nothing. No defense, no clarification, just a haunted silence, as if the foundations of his reign had been quietly pulled out from under him. William, standing inches from his father, reportedly clenched his jaw and stared into the parchment, blinking more than necessary. But he didn't speak either. His silence was not fear, it was calculation. This wasn't the time to speak. This was the moment to watch everything shift. Camilla, notably, was not present. Anne had been adamant. This was not a family drama. It was a constitutional reckoning. No distractions, no defences, just the Queen's final judgment. Delivered without ceremony. It wasn't accidental that Anne chose a setting so void of performance. She didn't want spectacle, she wanted impact. And she got it. Once the clause had been read, she didn't invite discussion. She didn't wait for applause or outrage. She simply folded the parchment back into its protective case and said, "You now know what she intended." The air thickened, and then, one by one, they stood shell-shocked, speechless, and forever changed. The instructions were clear. This revelation was to remain confidential until further review. No statements, no leaks. But this was the palace. Silence is a currency rarely spent wisely. Within hours, whispers slithered through corridors, echoing through staff kitchens and security offices. The Queen had left a final order. Camilla's title was never meant to rise, and Anne had just enforced that truth, not with force but with certainty. The monarchy hadn't experienced a moment this seismic since Diana walked away from the crown. But this time, no one walked. They stood and listened to the ghost of a queen reclaim her throne from beyond the grave. Yet, as word spread beyond the chamber, it wasn't Anne's voice that thundered through the monarchy. It was Camilla's reaction. Eyewitnesses described the scene as something between heartbreak and fury. Camilla once thought the most unshakable figure in the palace reportedly slammed a crystal tumbler against the fireplace, demanding, "Is this what she really thought of me?" Staff say she locked herself in her private quarters for hours, but it wouldn't end there. Camilla's next move would be bold, public, and impossible to reverse. The sound of glass shattering echoed loud, than any official statement ever could. Camilla, blindsided and burning with disbelief, had received no warning, no signal, not even a whisper. To her, this wasn't just a posthumous document. It was a betrayal, authored by a woman she had spent 2 decades trying to prove herself to. But what stung deeper was her belief that both Charles and Anne had known about the clause long before it surfaced. That they had sat with her, smiled beside her at royal engagements, and yet silently guarded a document that unravelled everything she had built. It wasn't the press or the public that stripped her down. It was the family she thought had finally let her in. By midnight, aides reported she had already tried to phone her press secretary twice, urging them to prepare a statement that would challenge the legitimacy of the clause. She wanted headlines, control, and a counterattack. But it was Charles who stepped in, pleading with her to pause, to breathe, to think. His intervention, rather than calming the fire, only fueled it. To Camilla, Charles's hesitation felt like complicity. If he wouldn't publicly defend her now, then perhaps he had always known this moment was inevitable. The man she believed would protect her crown now seemed more loyal to the woman who had already left the world behind in the hours that followed. Camilla made several private calls to members of the Parker Bowles family. According to sources close to the situation, she wanted advice, but more importantly, she wanted allies. She spoke openly about contesting the clause, suggesting it may have been added without proper documentation or legal oversight. There were even whispers of legal consultations. Questions are asked about whether a posthumous clause, no matter how sacred, could override a living king's authority. But even as she plotted, Camilla's world began to shrink. Palace staff, once devoted and diligent in their duties toward her, began walking on eggshells. The Queen Consort's image had been dented not by scandal or public scrutiny, but by the silent truth she had feared all along. She was never fully embraced. Not by the late Queen, not by the institution, not by history. She floated the idea quietly, but seriously, of stepping back from all public duties. Whether it was a threat or a cry for agency, the palace took it seriously. Contingency plans were drafted, schedules quietly adjusted. No announcements were made, but within those walls, a new question hovered: what happens if the consort walks away? Camilla may have felt cornered, but even in her rage, she knew one thing: she wasn't going to fade quietly. If she couldn't wear the crown without question, she would force the monarchy to answer for everyone they had about her. But she wouldn't be the only one moving in silence. Because as Camilla plotted her next move, another player entered the arena, someone who had remained curiously silent for weeks. The press thought Prince William was aligning with his father's vision, but they were wrong. Behind palace walls, William had quietly built his own vision of the future. And now, as the Queen's hidden clause detonated across the monarchy, William stood clear-eyed, resolved, and unshakably in support of Anne. What he said to Camilla in private will haunt the crown's legacy for years. For years, William played the dutiful son, walking the fine line between loyalty and restraint. But beneath that calm exterior was a prince shaped by scars no coronation could erase. The Queen's clause didn't surprise him, it vindicated him. In private, William had confided in Anne long before the parchment was ever revealed. He'd questioned the optics, the symbolism, and the wisdom of allowing Camilla's role to expand unchecked. He understood the public's reluctance, not as an observer, but as Diana's son. And when Anne brought the clause into the light, William didn't flinch. He leaned in. It wasn't rebellion, it was realignment. A course correction only he and Anne had been brave enough to see coming. But it was his confrontation with Camilla that changed everything. Behind closed doors, William asked to speak with her alone. What happened in that room wasn't anger, but devastation. For the first time in years he mentioned his mother by name, not in passing, not in protocol, but as a presence still shaping the destiny of the monarchy. She still deserves a voice in this, he told Camilla, his voice reportedly cracking under the weight of what had gone unsaid for too long. And then silence, no rebuttal, no comfort, only the heavy realization that the future was no longer hers to define. That night, William issued a quiet but seismic order. His communications team was instructed to halt all pro-Camilla briefings. No more soft-focus narratives, no more reshaping public perception. The time for image rehabilitation was over. What mattered now was integrity, not optics. His advisors protested, concerned about internal fallout. But William didn't waver. He wasn't protecting an institution anymore, he was protecting a promise. One he believed the Queen had entrusted to Anne, and by extension to him. That solidarity between Anne and William marked the birth of a new power block within the monarchy, not loud, not aggressive, but deliberate and resolute. Charles, meanwhile, found himself suspended in an impossible position, the King of Britain but no longer the axis around which royal loyalty orbited. On one side his wife shaken and enraged, on the other his son rising in clarity and confidence, and Anne, the enforcer of their mother's final wish, standing between them both. Charles's authority wasn't overthrown, but it was, for the first time, uncertain. And William's silence was no longer deference, it was declaration. He would no longer walk quietly behind a legacy he didn't believe in. He would lead toward one that honored where it truly began. With Charles now cornered between history and legacy, the monarchy faced its most defining pivot point yet. He waited his entire life to wear the crown only to realize it may slip through his fingers by dawn. Sources say Charles has not eaten a full meal in days, taking solitary walks at Balmoral. The weight of betrayal by his sister, his son, and now his late mother has led him to an unprecedented state. And behind those castle walls, something shattered. In the stillness of the Scottish Highlands, the king wandered with more questions than answers. Those close to him say he no longer speaks with certainty, but with a kind of mourning usually reserved for the death of a dream. The clause had landed like a blow to the chest, not because of its wording, but because of who wrote it. To Charles, the Queen's handwritten addendum was more than a final instruction. It was a judgment, and worse, a confirmation that his reign would always exist under the long shadow of his mother's unspoken disapproval. To a senior aide, Charles reportedly whispered, "I feel orphaned by her final act." In that moment, the man once called the longest-waiting heir became a king at war with the very legacy he inherited. The palace staff had never seen him like this. Seasoned courtiers described a man unravelling not in scandal, but in sorrow. Charles had always been complex, layered, at times fragile, but now those layers had peeled back to reveal someone almost unrecognizable. He no longer trusted his instincts. He questioned every decision he had made since the day he first asked the public to accept Camilla. There were nights, they say, where he didn't sleep at all, just paced. And in the rare moments he did speak, the words held a haunted clarity. "What if I was never meant to be king?" he asked, not to anyone in particular, but to the heir, to the past, to a mother no longer here to answer. On 2 consecutive mornings, Charles made quiet visits to Queen Elizabeth's grave alone, without security, without fanfare. To the outside world, these were moments of grief. But to those watching closely, they were confessions. He was seeking answers from someone who had already given him her final word. And buried within the silence of those visits was a whisper of doubt that shook the monarchy's very core. A draft letter never sent but seen by trusted advisers was written in Charles's own hand. Addressed to Parliament, it explored in raw and honest prose what it would mean to relinquish the crown, not immediately, not in disgrace, but voluntarily, with dignity. The mere existence of that letter now hangs over the monarchy like a question mark no one is ready to confront. And then there was Camilla. Once the source of Charles's strength, now the symbol of everything unravelling, their once solid bond had fractured under the strain of a clause neither saw coming. Their conversations, once filled with shared ambitions, had turned terse, quiet, fractured by mistrust. Charles didn't blame her, but he couldn't reassure her either. His silence became her wound, and her rage became his shame. And with every passing day, the marriage that had survived the court of public opinion now strained under the weight of the Queen's final truth. But, as Charles faltered, a new centre of power quietly emerged, and it wasn't where anyone expected. While others shouted, Catherine listened. While others defended their titles, she focused on duty. But now, in the vacuum left by Charles's uncertainty and Camilla's unravelling, it was Catherine's calm authority that began to reshape the crown's centre. What she whispered to Anne in private may have changed the future of the monarchy forever. For over a year, Catherine had carried the weight of a truth she could not speak. Anne had trusted her early on, sensing not only discretion but strength in the Princess of Wales. She had shown Catherine the clause in confidence, not to alarm her but to prepare her. "There will come a moment," Anne had said, "when you'll know silence is no longer service." And so Catherine waited. She watched the tides move around her, never once breaking composure. When the world assumed she was uninvolved, she was absorbing. When critics claimed she lacked presence, she was positioning herself quietly where influence truly mattered. Behind closed doors, she read and reread the Queen's final clause. Not to weaponize it, but to understand it. What set Catherine apart was her refusal to descend into reaction. As Camilla raged and Charles faltered, Catherine remained a pillar of restraint. Her presence, far from passive, became a compass for the shaken monarchy. A leaked photo snapped without her knowledge showed her poring over royal protocol texts that hadn't been opened in decades. No public statement, no defiance, just preparation. She wasn't waiting for chaos to pass, she was preparing to lead through it. One aide whispered that the Queen had likely seen this strength in her long ago. Another referred to her not as a rising star, but as the monarchy's hidden spine. It didn't take long for the palace staff to give her a name that hadn't been used before: the Crown Whisperer. It wasn't a volume. It was about precision. Catherine's ability to say less and command more had now become the stabilizing force behind the institution's most fragile moment in years. Every move she made was measured, every silence strategic. Even William, visibly altered by the emotional confrontations of recent days, found his footing only in her presence. "She holds the monarchy together," one insider confessed, even when it doesn't realize it's breaking. Yet for all her calm, Catherine was not untouched by the emotional cost of the upheaval. She had watched the man she loved choose principle over peace, and she knew what that sacrifice meant. She had seen Anne's face the day the clause was read, stoic, but exhausted, and she had observed Camilla's spiral with an ache that was more sorrow than satisfaction. But her allegiance was never in question. Catherine had already chosen which future she believed in, and her actions now made it clear it was not one built on reshaping the past, but on honouring its truths. And so, when she met with Anne after the council chamber exploded in whispers, she spoke just one sentence: "It's time." Yet amid all the emotional reckoning, there was one more twist left in the Queen's final letter, one that changed everything. At the very bottom of the parchment, in a postscript written in trembling ink, lay the true blow: "This clause shall be revealed should the consort ever seek the crown for herself." It wasn't a preference, it was a trap set decades ago, awaiting the moment Camilla stepped too far. And in that moment, the Queen's foresight became prophecy. What appeared to be a straightforward clause evolved into something far more calculated, a premeditated safeguard against ambition cloaked in loyalty. The Queen, in her final hours of complete clarity, had written what could only be described as a contingency against legacy being rewritten. The clause wasn't simply a response to Camilla's presence, it was a response to the Crown's vulnerability. Elizabeth had foreseen the slippery slope of title inflation, how symbolism could evolve into power if left unchecked. So she crafted her final move with the precision of a sovereign who'd weathered 7 decades of quiet war. Her words were not emotional, they were exacting. Her postscript made it unmistakable. This document wasn't to be weaponized unless the consort herself reached beyond the bounds of ceremonial duty. Camilla's recent ascension in branding, stepping from consort to queen, had triggered the release mechanism. Legal advisors were stunned. What many had thought was a sentimental note turned out to hold constitutional implications. The phrase "shall be revealed" carried undeniable force. Experts are now quietly debating whether the clause could retroactively revoke the informal transition of titles and status Camilla had already adopted. Behind palace doors, meetings turned from emotional to strategic. The Queen's final postscript hadn't just spoken from the grave, it had pulled the rug out from under Camilla's claim. This wasn't an opinion piece, it was structural collapse. Anne, in a moment of harrowing honesty, revealed she had once considered destroying the document, not out of malice but mercy. The night she rediscovered the postscript, she stood before a fire, parchment in hand, flame ready. But something stopped her. Not duty, not guilt. Catherine. It was Catherine who, in that quiet, breathless moment, told Anne, "If you burn it, we lose the one voice that still protects this family." And that was the moment Anne sealed her resolve not to punish, but to preserve. The postscript lived not because of protocol, but because of Catherine's whispered instinct. According to private notes passed between former aides, the Queen had drafted the postscript shortly after Camilla began giving speeches that hinted at a growing influence, public statements that stirred unease among older members of the firm. Elizabeth, ever the strategist, saw where things were headed long before they reached this crisis point. Her final act wasn't vengeance. It was foresight. The postscript was never meant to shame, it was meant to shield, to protect the monarchy not just from public opinion, but from internal erosion. Camilla's fate wasn't sealed by scandal or rebellion. It was sealed by a sovereign who had already planned her checkmate years ago. But the Queen's chess move complete, the board reset, leaving only one question: who holds the crown's future now? As the dust settled over the monarchy's most intimate betrayal, one thing became clear: the Queen never truly left. Her voice echoed through Anne, her will guided Catherine, and her legacy challenged Charles. What began as a hidden clause has become the fulcrum of a new era, one where tradition bows not to personalities, but to destiny. And that destiny now points unmistakably toward Catherine. In the days that followed the revelation of the clause, public sentiment shifted with startling speed. The royal family, once seen as stoic and impenetrable, was now viewed through a lens of vulnerability and truth. Polling numbers quietly confirmed what whispers across the country had already revealed. Support for Anne and Catherine's quiet, unwavering loyalty to the Queen's wishes surged. Public trust, long fractured by uncertainty, began to coalesce around the women who hadn't raised their voices, but instead honored the one that could no longer speak. Across media, commentary shifted tone. No longer focused on Camilla's reaction or Charles's silence, attention turned to Catherine's calm resolve and Anne's formidable sense of duty. Together they had not defied the monarchy, they had preserved it. Behind the scenes, Parliament insiders began informal discussions that had, until now, remained taboo. The role of the consort, its definition, its scope, its limitations, was being quietly reconsidered. For decades, the line between ceremonial support and sovereign influence had blurred. But Queen Elizabeth's final act forced clarity. There would be no more ambiguity, no more elevation based on public relations strategies. The crown, once reactive, had found its compass again. And with that shift came a new rhythm, subtle but unmistakable. William and Catherine's public schedule began to expand. Where Charles once stood at the centre of major engagements, it was now his son and daughter-in-law who carried the flag forward. Handshakes, speeches, brief appearances. Each one felt like a passing of the torch without anyone needing to say the words. Camilla, though still present, began to recede from the spotlight. Not by royal decree, but by recognition. Her role had reached its limit, not in scandal or disgrace, but by quiet design. She remained in royal residence, attended small functions, and kept to the margins of national events. What once was a campaign to shape her legacy had been replaced by an unspoken understanding. The public and history had made their decision, and in this recalibrated monarchy there was no longer room for reinterpretation of the past, only room to secure the future. Charles, too, adjusted. He continued as king, but his presence no longer bore the same gravitational pull. He no longer needed to be the future. He simply had to be the bridge. The monarchy had become less about one man's reign and more about what would come next. That next chapter, forged in the embers of hidden ink and ancestral resolve, now lived through Catherine. A woman once seen as a consort in training had emerged in silence and strength as the monarchy's moral centre. She didn't chase the crown, it found her, through trust, composure, and an unshakable devotion to a queen's dying wish. The Queen's final clause didn't fracture the monarchy, it fortified it. It exposed what was weak, protected what was sacred, and ensured that the future would be led not by those who wanted power, but by those who had earned the weight of it. Anne upheld the command. Catherine embodied its promise. Together, they didn't just follow the Queen's legacy, they fulfilled it. And so, from a silent envelope hidden in a royal desk, a storm was unleashed, and with it, the beginning of the monarchy's next chapter. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.